When procurement professionals think about negotiating with a supplier, one of the things that they often consider right from the very beginning is the amount of relative leverage they have based on company size. Anybody that's ever had to negotiate a contract with Amazon Web Services or Microsoft knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now, interestingly, and as we're going to hear this week, large companies do have to think about the same thing. Even McDonald's, who happens to be the largest buyer of beef in the world. In October of 2024, McDonald's sued four of the world's largest meat producers, Tyson, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef Packing, for allegedly conspiring to inflate the price of beef by creating artificial scarcity in the market. Now, this lawsuit is a tactic they have used before with both pork and chicken in the recent years. And there have been other lawsuits from McDonald's, but also from ranchers, retailers, and restaurant companies. And mixed into all of this, we have a confidential whistleblower, which is always the sign of a good business news story. So in this week's episode of Art of Supply, I'm going to take you through the basics of this case. We will meet the cast of characters that participate in the U.S. beef supply chain, and then we will consider the complexity, or is it collusion, associated with trying to track cost and price data in what is a highly concentrated market. Now let's start with the beef supply chain itself. Ranchers raise and sell cattle, which in this case are referred to as fed cattle, meaning they are sold to processors already ready for slaughter. They don't need to be further fattened up. Then we get to the meat packers. This is where we meet the people facing charges in this case: JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and National Beef Packaging. They slaughter the cattle and process the meat so it can be packaged for any different number of preparation styles and consumption formats. Now, their customers are companies like McDonald's, but also grocery retailers and wholesalers. And then finally, we reach the end consumer, which gets this product either in a restaurant or in a supermarket. Now, there are some other steps and processes in here. I'm definitely staying high level, but that gives you a basic sense of the players. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper into some of the details of this market. These four companies, JBS, Tyson, Cargill, and National Beef, are responsible for 80% of U.S. beef production. The McDonald's suit claims that they have violated U.S. antitrust law, Sherman antitrust law specifically, by coordinating to lower the prices for slaughter-ready cattle and then slowing plant production, which artificially raises the prices of beef. So on the one hand, they're looking at cattle, sort of the raw material in this case, and on the other hand, beef, but they're the crossover point between these two products. In the case, McDonald's refers to this as, quote, restraint of commerce. And the court filing reads in part, quote, in 2018, defendants Tyson Fresh, CMS, Swift Packerland, and National Beef, collectively referred to as the operating defendants, sold approximately 80% of the more than 25 million pounds of fresh and frozen beef supplied to the U.S. market. Collectively, they controlled approximately 81 to 85% of the domestic market-ready fed cattle processed or slaughtered during what they're defining as the conspiracy period. So this takes us back to the cattle versus the beef. These four companies sell 80% of the processed beef, and they buy 81 to 85% of all fed cattle in the United States. These are staggering numbers when we think about the fact that only four companies are involved. McDonald's claims that this has been going on since 2015. Now, interestingly, during this conspiracy period, McDonald's made the decision to start using fresh meat for its quarter pounders. That was back in 2018. And a decision like that, while appealing to the consumer, does raise the cost of those burgers because fresh meat is often pricier, making them more subject to market rates. Even without the added stress of the fresh quarter pounder, the price of ground beef has almost tripled since 2010. And because of this, McDonald's is not the only company that has sued the Packers. There's a group of ranchers in Minnesota that have sued. And then there are a number of grocery chains, retailers, and restaurant companies, specifically BJ's Wholesale, Sodexo, Target, and Aldi. There is a literal scatter trail of lawsuits just like these going back years and even extending out from beef into the pork and chicken markets. In fact, one of the news stories I read reported that there are over 200 lawsuits, either pending, other way, or that have been filed against the producers. In the few cases that the meat packers have agreed to settle, it is usually without admitting any wrongdoing, but the settlement amounts run into the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars each time. For instance, in 2022, JBS agreed to a $52.5 million settlement in a price-fixing case that was brought by a group of wholesalers and grocery stores. Tyson agreed to pay $221 million back in 2021 in a class action chicken price-fixing lawsuit that involved Walmart and Chick-fil-A as plaintiffs. There are two fairly basic economic ideas that we see running through all of these cases. One is supply and demand. When supply is constrained and demand either stays the same or increases, prices are going to go up. When you have only 4 producers that control 80% of one market, naturally there's going to be some concern about how that market functions. In fact, the next largest beef producer after the big 4 is only responsible for 2 to 3% of the market. So that's a massive drop. If we assume, which we know isn't the case, but just for quick math, that these 4 producers evenly split that 80%, that puts them all at 20%, meaning the next producer is at 1/10 of the size of one of those companies. So you would think traditionally there'd be an incentive for new companies to enter the market, but it has been so dominated. No one is going to have the opportunity to actually grow their capabilities enough to start competing with the big 4. The other dynamic is what we would expect to see from complementary or downstream markets. So for instance, let's step away from meat for a minute. Let's think about fuel. You would expect the price for a barrel of oil to be connected in some way to the prices we see at the pump. There's going to be some amount of delay as markets shift, and there might be some difference, for instance, based on state and local taxes or the amount and cost of transportation required. But directionally, everything's going to be aligned. You certainly wouldn't expect to see oil prices drop while the price at the pump soars. And yet, that is exactly what has been happening with cattle and beef. I think it's a fair comparison to this idea of oil and gas because you've got, a refining process, we could call it. And as you go through that process, you're getting closer and closer to the end consumer. Now, as reported by the news site Progressive Farmer, quote, before 2015, prices of cattle and beef predictably moved in tandem. That correlation was the result of a natural economic relationship in a competitive market because beef is simply processed cattle. But beginning in approximately 2015, this fundamental economic relationship between cattle and beef prices changed. The degree of correlation of cattle and beef prices diverged to the operating defendant's benefit without any credible non-collusive explanation. Now, it is interesting, as Progressive Farmer reports, that before 2015, the cattle prices and the beef prices moved together, and that 2015 is the starting point of that collusion window that McDonald's talks about. Now, in that window as well, we know that McDonald's switched to fresh beef for their quarter pounder. In the same year that happened, the Federal General Accounting Office launched an investigation into the beef market because they noticed this change in dynamic as well. They said that the beef market was, quote, not behaving rationally. Now, that's not to say that it was being emotional in some way, but it simply wasn't operating the way a competitive market should. Their solution was to advocate for additional transparency and, ideally, more competition in the market, neither of which actually happened because there are only four companies that control the vast majority of the market. And naturally, all eyes are on them, but they don't really have any incentive to drive change. So who can make them change if they don't want to? Well, if McDonald's, the largest beef buyer in the world, doesn't have enough leverage to cause change here, it's going to take action on the part of the federal government. Now, it is interesting to step back and take a look at this Minnesota cattle ranchers case. Now, they are one of the groups suing this big four, and they claim they have lost billions of dollars. They sell the animals directly to the meat packers. And in fact, it has been described as very deliberate collusion on the part of the meat packers. They refer to it as a scheme, a conspiracy. Now, in this case, it was dismissed by the court because they said there is simply too much time that passes between the cattle stage and the beef stage, and too many other hands in the process to prove what the ranchers are alleging. The courts have said that these ranchers cannot rebring the case until they can prove a direct connection between the cattle price and the beef price to prove that it's being manipulated. Now, this is just the start of the really dramatic stuff where we start to get into real sort of conspiracy theory sounding ideas. And a lot of this, McDonald's has alleged in writing in the case. They say that they have evidence that Tyson, JBS USA, Swift, and Packerland, CMS, and National Beef conducted daily meetings from 2015 to 2019, quote, typically from their head offices. So they're saying that decision makers at these companies were coming together to meet to control volumes of beef that would be processed, how they would achieve that by running their factories, and that it was all done deliberately. There is also, interestingly, a confidential witness, someone who formerly worked at Swift and who said that these regular meetings were taking place. Not only did these meetings take place at the headquarters, they also happened at industry events like conferences. It just created an off-site opportunity, allegedly, for these companies to come together. This confidential witness, known as Witness One, was actually discovered in the Minnesota ranchers case. And it was his testimony that was unsealed and that McDonald's is now citing as evidence in their own case. The question that still remains to be answered, and which is certainly going to be litigated, is whether the meat packers are deliberately pricing and moving in tandem around their decisions, or whether they're just responding to the same market conditions. The fact remains that all of them produced less beef, 2015 and on, than they did in the period of time before that. And McDonald's actually holds this up as part of the proof for what they're alleging. They say that some smaller producers did try to enter the field, but that it simply wasn't enough to fill the gap and have any impact on price. We do have numbers from the suit based on the per price pound for cattle deviating from beef. So historically, the per pound price of cattle had stayed within $20 to $40 of the per pound average wholesale price of beef. In 2015, however, we see that start to change. So the average price per pound difference between cattle and beef in advance of 2015 was about $34. Between 2015 and 2019, that jumped to $60. In 2020, it hit $122, and by 2021 had reached $156 difference per pound. Now, there are some people covering this space who've spoken up in defense of the meat packers. Certainly, they have come out in their own defense and claimed that other factors like worker shortages, especially during COVID, made it difficult for them to operate meat processing plants at the level they would have liked to have, and that naturally not artificially or illegally constrained volume. Paul Savage, who's the director of commodities forecasting for beef, pork, and poultry products at ArrowStream, has said, quote, "Right now, the cattle farmers are making money. It's the packers that are barely making any money." In the 5 years from 2018 to 2023, he pointed out that beef packers were making profits of more than $100 per head of cattle. But now they're barely breaking even, clearing $10 to $20 per head. So what he's basically saying is that this market is cyclical, and in some cases, the price being paid for cattle is falling out of alignment with the price being paid for beef. Now, I still go back to my initial point. It's interesting that we're not talking about small no-name players. We're talking about McDonald's and then some of the biggest meat producers in the world. Clearly, they've made the decision that it's most beneficial for McDonald's to conduct their negotiation in court. It's going to be a slow process and one that, in my opinion, is unlikely to actually change the structure of this market. That said, I have a feeling that if the smart folks at McDonald's thought there was another way, they probably would have tried it by now.